My ex-wife coached our children to cry on camera to extort money from me. Child support got reversed. My ex-wife Melissa discovered that crying children equaled cash. Every Sunday when I picked up our kids, Jake and Ruby, she'd have her phone ready. She'd whisper something to them right before they got in my car, and they'd start sobbing. Then Monday morning, I'd get a video. Your children are crying because they don't have new tablets. $300 by Thursday, or I'm calling my lawyer. Tuesday, another video. Ruby upset because her dance class friends all have better leotards. $400 by Friday. Wednesday, crying about not having the same sneakers as classmates. $200 by end of day. The thing is, I already paid $1,500 in monthly child support, plus half of all activities, medical bills, and school expenses. The court order was clear. But Melissa had figured out that videos of crying children made me panic and pay. She was right. For 6 months, I sent whatever she demanded. The videos got worse. She'd film them in their room surrounded by old toys, wearing clothes that looked worn even though I'd just bought them new wardrobes. Sometimes she'd have them hold signs she wrote. "We miss Daddy, but Mommy says he won't help us." I knew she was coaching them. Jake was 7, Ruby was 5. They didn't talk like that. But what was I supposed to do? Let my kids suffer to prove a point? Then one weekend, I overheard Ruby talking to her stuffed animal. "Mommy says if I cry really hard, she'll buy me ice cream. But I have to look really sad first. That's the game we play for Daddy." That changed everything. I started paying attention during pickups. Melissa drove a new Lexus. She had fresh highlights every month. Designer bags that weren't there during our marriage. But the kids were her props for poverty. So I decided to play director too. The next weekend, I took the kids to the park. While they played, I had a conversation with another dad there, loud enough for them to hear. "Yeah, money's been really tight," I said to him. "Had to sell my watch, skip meals sometimes, but making sure the kids have everything they need is what matters." Jake looked over at me. I pretended not to notice. That night at bedtime, Jake asked if I was really skipping meals. "Sometimes, buddy," I said, "but that's okay. Parents do that. You and Ruby having food is more important." He got quiet. Monday came. Melissa sent her usual video. Kids crying about wanting new bikes. $800 by Wednesday. I replied that I didn't have it. Things were tight. I'd been selling things to make the support payments. She sent back laughing emojis. Not my problem. Find it, or I call my lawyer. Tuesday night, I picked the kids up for my scheduled dinner. Melissa had them in the same worn clothes she used for videos, even though I could see their good clothes in the laundry basket behind her. At McDonald's, I counted out exact change for their happy meals, then told them I wasn't hungry. The kids exchanged looks. "Daddy, you can have some of my nuggets," Ruby offered. "I'm okay, sweetheart. You eat." When I dropped them off, they ran straight to Melissa. I heard Jake through the door. "Daddy didn't eat dinner. He said he doesn't have money." Melissa laughed. "He's lying, baby. Daddy has lots of money. He just doesn't want to share." Wednesday morning, no video. Thursday, nothing. Friday, Melissa called. "The kids are acting weird," she said. "They keep trying to give me their allowance for you." I stayed confused. For me? Why would they do that? She got frustrated. "Jake saw me buying my new purse and asked why I have money for purses, but Daddy doesn't have money for food." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing," I said. "Must be confusing for them to see you with new things while telling them we don't have money for what they need." She hung up. That weekend, the kids brought bags of snacks from home. Ruby handed me fruit cups. "So you don't get hungry, Daddy." Jake had made sandwiches with his own hands, messy peanut butter and jelly. "We brought these for you." Melissa watched from the doorway, arms crossed. The next week, something shifted. The kids started asking her questions. Why did she have a new purse if they needed new bikes? Why did she get her nails done if they needed tablets? Kids notice everything when you teach them to look. 2 weeks later, Melissa called a meeting. "The videos need to stop," I said simply. "They're confusing the children." She sat across from me, fidgeting with her phone. "They're worried about you not eating," she said quietly. "They tried to sell their toys at school. Ruby told her teacher her daddy was hungry. The teacher called me." I nodded. "Must be hard for them to understand why you tell them we're poor while driving a Lexus." She stared at her hands. 3 weeks went by, no videos. Then Melissa texted, "We need to talk in person." The message sat on my screen for 5 minutes before I replied. I suggested the coffee shop on Main Street, tomorrow at 2 while the kids were at the school. She agreed immediately. I spent the rest of the day wondering what changed. 3 weeks of silence after months of constant demands, and now she wanted to meet face to face. I showed up 10 minutes early and picked a table in the back corner where we could talk without an audience. Melissa walked in at exactly 2, wearing jeans and a plain sweater instead of her usual designer clothes. She sat down across from me and kept her eyes on the table. Her fingers twisted the napkin in front of her into tiny shreds. I waited. She needed to be the one to start this conversation. Finally, she looked up, just for a second, then back down at her hands. "The videos got out of hand," she said quietly. "I know that now. The kids are confused and upset, and I think we need to figure out a better way to handle things. A better arrangement that works for both of us." I kept my face neutral and asked what kind of arrangement she had in mind. She took a breath and laid it out like she'd been practicing. 500 a month, cash, on top of the regular support. No more videos, no more demands. We both just forget the whole thing happened and move forward. Her voice got stronger as she talked, like she thought this was a reasonable solution. Like she was doing me a favor by only asking for 500 instead of the random amounts she'd been demanding. I let the silence stretch out between us. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, waiting for me to agree. Instead, I told her I needed time to think about it. "We should probably both talk to lawyers first," I said. "Make sure any new arrangement is legal and actually protects the kids." Her whole body went stiff. The soft, apologetic version of Melissa disappeared in half a second. Her jaw clenched, and she stared at me with the same hard look I remembered from our divorce. "Why do we need lawyers?" she asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. "We can handle this ourselves like adults." I stood up and said I'd be in touch after I talked to someone who knew family law. She didn't say anything else, just grabbed her purse and walked out ahead of me. That weekend, I had the kids from Friday night through Sunday afternoon. Saturday morning, Jake was quiet during breakfast, pushing his cereal around in the bowl without eating much. Finally, he looked up at me with worried eyes. "Are you really selling your stuff to pay for our food?" I put down my coffee and pulled my chair closer to his. I explained that Mommy had been confused about our money situation for a while. She thought I didn't have enough to take care of them, but that wasn't true. I was working on clearing everything up, so nobody had to worry anymore. He seemed relieved, but still uncertain. Ruby was playing with her dolls in the living room when I sat down next to her on the floor. She immediately stopped playing and her bottom lip started to tremble. "Did I do something bad by telling you about the crying game?" she asked. Her voice was so small I had to lean in to hear her. I pulled her onto my lap and promised her she did exactly the right thing by being honest. Being truthful is always good, even when it's hard. I told her I was proud of her for telling me the truth. She wrapped her arms around my neck and squeezed tight. The rest of the weekend felt lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted off all three of us. Monday morning, I called the number my coworker had given me 2 weeks earlier. Blake Simmons ran a family law practice downtown and had a reputation for being tough, but fair. His secretary scheduled me for that afternoon. I spent my lunch break at home gathering everything. Printed copies of every video Melissa had sent. Screenshots of all the text messages with her demands and deadlines. Bank statements showing every payment I'd made beyond the court-ordered support. 6 months of documentation filled a 2-inch binder. Blake's office was on the 3rd floor of an old building that had been renovated into professional suites. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. We shook hands, and he gestured to the chair across from his desk. I handed him the binder, and he started at the beginning. The first video played on his computer, Ruby crying about tablets. His expression stayed neutral. Second video, Jake sobbing about bikes. His jaw tightened slightly. Third video, both kids with signs. His face got darker. He went through every single one without saying a word. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is parental alienation combined with extortion," he finally said. "The coaching alone is serious. The financial demands on top of documented support payments make it worse. You have solid grounds to request custody modification and reimbursement of the extortion payments." He asked detailed questions about the custody schedule, the kids' adjustment, any other concerning behaviors. I answered everything as completely as I could. By the end of the meeting, he had filled 6 pages with notes. Blake pulled out a legal pad and walked me through next steps. Document everything going forward. Every interaction, every exchange, every conversation. Keep all communication in writing from now on. Text or email only, no phone calls unless absolutely necessary. Most importantly, do not pay anything beyond the court-ordered amounts. Not $1. If she threatens to call her lawyer, let her. We want this in front of a judge. He'd file a motion to modify custody and support arrangements within the week. The court would likely order evaluations and appoint someone to represent the kids' interests. The process would take months, but the documentation I'd gathered gave us a strong position. I left his office feeling like I could finally breathe properly. That night, my phone rang at 8:30, Melissa's name on the screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering. She didn't bother with hello. "Did you contact a lawyer?" Her voice was sharp and angry. I confirmed that I had and suggested she do the same. We needed to resolve this properly through the court system, where everything could be handled legally and fairly. She started yelling about how I was trying to destroy her relationship with her own children. How dare I involve lawyers in a private family matter? How I was being vindictive and cruel. I stayed calm and repeated that all communication needed to go through our attorneys from now on. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt steady inside. The game had changed, and this time, I wasn't playing by her rules. She started yelling about how I was trying to destroy her relationship with the kids. Her voice got louder with each word, talking about how dare I involve lawyers in what should be a private family matter. She called me vindictive and cruel for taking this route instead of working things out between us like adults. I let her finish without interrupting. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I repeated that all communication needed to go through our attorneys from this point forward. She started up again, threatening to tell Jake and Ruby that I was being mean to their mommy and trying to take them away from her. I stayed calm and told her that making threats was exactly why we needed lawyers involved. Then I hung up. My hands shook as I set the phone down, but inside I felt steady and clear about the decision. Blake moved fast. The next morning, he filed the motion for emergency custody evaluation and modification hearing at the courthouse. The paperwork included everything we'd discussed, laying out the pattern of coached videos and financial extortion over 6 months. He added a specific request for the court to appoint a guardian ad litem who would represent Jake and Ruby's interests separately from either parent. Someone who could talk to the kids, observe our interactions, and tell the judge what was actually best for them, instead of what either Melissa or I claimed. The filing went through by noon, and Blake called to confirm the court had accepted it. A hearing date would be set within the next few weeks. He reminded me again to document everything and keep all communication with Melissa in writing only. 2 days passed without any contact from Melissa. Then my phone rang during my lunch break at work. The caller ID showed Jake's school number. I answered and heard the school counselor introduce herself. She explained that Jake had come to see her during a routine check in that morning. The school did these sessions with all students a few times per year to make sure kids were doing okay emotionally and academically. During the conversation, Jake had mentioned the videos and what he called the crying game. He'd told the counselor about how his mom would have them cry on camera and then show the videos to me. He'd also talked about being confused because his mom said we didn't have money, but then bought herself new things. The counselor's voice was professional, but concerned as she explained that she was required to document this as a concerning disclosure. Any indication that children might be involved in parental manipulation or coached behaviors had to be recorded and could be reported to the appropriate authorities. She wanted me to know that she'd be writing up her notes from the session and keeping them in Jake's file. I thanked her for calling and asked if I could authorize her to share that documentation with my attorney. She said yes, that would be fine if I signed a release form. I drove to the school that afternoon and filled out the paperwork allowing the counselor to communicate with Blake and share any relevant information about Jake's statements. This outside corroboration made the case significantly stronger. It wasn't just my word against Melissa's anymore. A trained professional at the kids' school had independently documented Jake talking about the exact behaviors I'd been describing. Blake was pleased when I called him with the update. He said having a third-party witness, especially someone in a position to observe the children regularly, added serious weight to our position. The following week, Blake's phone rang while I was sitting in his office going over some additional documentation. He answered, listened for a few minutes, then put the call on speaker after getting permission from the person on the other end. It was Melissa's lawyer. The voice was smooth and professional, suggesting that perhaps we could work something out before the hearing. They wanted to avoid getting the court involved if possible and settle everything privately between the two parties. Blake asked what kind of settlement they had in mind. The lawyer got vague, talking about finding a middle ground that respected both parents and kept the focus on the children's well-being. Blake thanked them for reaching out and said he'd discuss it with his client, then ended the call. He looked at me and said that Melissa's legal team reaching out this early told him they knew her position was weak. People who felt confident in their case didn't try to negotiate before the evidence even got presented to a judge. Blake advised strongly against any private settlement at this point. We needed the full custody evaluation completed first. Without a professional assessment of what had been happening and how it affected Jake and Ruby, we couldn't make informed decisions about what arrangement would actually serve the kids best. He wanted everything documented officially through the court system rather than worked out in private conversations where details could get fuzzy later. I agreed. This wasn't about punishing Melissa or winning some battle. It was about making sure the kids grew up in an environment where they weren't used as tools for manipulation or money. We needed experts to evaluate the situation and tell us what was actually healthy for two young children who'd been caught in the middle of their parents' conflict. 3 weeks after Blake filed the motion, I received official notice that the court had appointed Mariah Day as guardian ad litem for Jake and Ruby. The letter explained that she would be conducting interviews with both parents, observing custody exchanges, talking to the children in age-appropriate ways, and making recommendations to the judge about what custody arrangement would best serve their interests. She wasn't working for me or for Melissa. Her only job was representing what Jake and Ruby needed, even if that wasn't what either parent wanted. The letter included her contact information and a request that I call within 3 business days to schedule an initial interview. I contacted her office that same afternoon and set up a meeting for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. Mariah's office was in a building near the courthouse, small but comfortable with chairs that didn't feel like waiting room furniture. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with an expression that seemed kind, but also very observant. We shook hands, and she led me to her office. The interview lasted 2 hours. She asked detailed questions about the custody schedule, how the kids acted during transitions, what activities they enjoyed, how I handled discipline and homework and bedtime routines. Then she asked about the videos. I showed her everything on my phone, the same documentation I'd given Blake. She watched several of them, her face staying neutral and professional. I explained how I'd discovered what Melissa was doing and then described my counter-strategy of performing financial hardship to expose the manipulation. This was the hard part. I admitted that I was worried my tactics might have confused the children too. I'd used similar manipulation, even if my goal was defensive rather than extractive. Jake and Ruby had been caught between 2 parents playing games with their emotions and perceptions. I told Mariah I regretted that part and wished I'd gone straight to a lawyer instead of trying to handle it myself first. She appreciated my honesty about using similar manipulation tactics, even though my purposes were defensive. She explained that her job wasn't to punish either parent or decide who was right or wrong in the adult conflict. Her only focus was determining what would serve Jake and Ruby's best interests going forward. She'd be looking at stability, emotional safety, each parent's ability to prioritize the children's needs over personal grievances, and whether the kids were being protected from adult conflicts or pulled into them. She'd be observing how both Melissa and I interacted with the children, how the kids responded to each of us, and whether there were signs of ongoing coaching or manipulation from either side. The evaluation would take several weeks and include multiple observations and interviews. Then she'd write a detailed report with recommendations for the judge. She thanked me for being thorough with the documentation and for being honest about my own role in the situation. That kind of self-awareness and willingness to acknowledge mistakes usually indicated a parent who could prioritize their children's well-being over their own ego. 2 weeks later, I got a text from Mariah asking if she could observe the custody exchange that Friday evening. I confirmed and let her know the usual time and location where Melissa and I did the handoffs. Friday came, and I arrived at the agreed spot 5 minutes early. Mariah was already there, parked across the street with a clear view. Melissa pulled up right on time in her Lexus. She got out and opened the back doors for Jake and Ruby. Her whole manner was different from usual. She was overly cheerful, her voice bright and loud as she talked about how much she'd missed them for 2 whole days. She kept touching their shoulders and smoothing their hair while telling them to be good for Daddy and that she loved them so much. Ruby pulled away from the touch after a few seconds and ran toward my car without looking back. Jake followed more slowly, glancing between his mom and me with an uncertain expression. Melissa's smile stayed plastered on her face, but I noticed it disappeared completely the moment both kids turned around and couldn't see her anymore. She got back in her car without acknowledging me at all. I buckled the kids in and drove away, catching Mariah writing notes in her car as we passed. The following week, Mariah called to schedule separate interviews with Jake and Ruby at her office. She gave me a specific date and told me the kids would need to come alone. I drove them to the building on Wednesday afternoon, a plain brick office with a small waiting room that had toys and books scattered on a low table. Ruby grabbed my hand when we walked in, but Jake stood stiff beside me, looking around the room like he was measuring how much trouble he might be in. Mariah came out from a back hallway and smiled at both of them, warm and friendly, but professional. She asked me to wait in the lobby while she talked with each child individually. Ruby went first, following Mariah down the hall without looking back at me. I sat in one of the chairs and picked up a magazine but couldn't focus on any of the words. 40 minutes passed before Ruby came back out, her face calm and neutral. She climbed into the chair next to me and started coloring in one of the activity books on the table. Jake's turn lasted even longer, over an hour and 15 minutes. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red like he'd been crying, but his expression was closed off and guarded. Mariah walked him back to me and said she'd be in touch with my attorney soon. The ride home was quiet, both kids staring out their windows without talking. 3 weeks later, Blake called me at work. He'd just received Mariah's preliminary report, and his tone was serious but encouraging. She'd identified several concerning patterns in her interviews with Jake and Ruby, particularly around coached behaviors and confusion about emotional authenticity. Her report documented specific statements the kids made about the crying game and their understanding of how emotions could be performed for results. She recommended both children undergo psychological evaluation with a specialist who could assess the full emotional impact of what they'd experienced. Blake explained this was actually good news for our case because it meant the guardian ad litem was taking the coaching seriously and wanted professional assessment before making custody recommendations. He filed a motion that afternoon requesting the court order psychological evaluations for both children. The hearing for that motion happened 2 weeks later. The judge reviewed Mariah's preliminary findings and agreed that professional evaluation was necessary. He ordered both Jake and Ruby to see Liliana Barnhart, a child psychologist who specialized in parental alienation cases and custody disputes. Melissa's lawyer stood up immediately and objected, arguing that the children were fine and didn't need therapy, that this was just another way for me to attack their mother and waste the court's time. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and said the children's welfare wasn't up for debate. If the guardian ad litem recommended evaluation, then evaluation would happen. He signed the order right there in the courtroom. Blake collected the signed paperwork and scheduled Ruby's first appointment for the following Tuesday. Ruby's session with Liliana went smoothly, according to the brief update I got afterward. Liliana's office sent a short message through Blake, confirming that Ruby had been cooperative and engaged during the appointment. She'd answered questions appropriately for her age and seemed comfortable in the therapy setting. That was all the information I could get until Liliana completed her full evaluation and wrote her formal report. The lack of details made me anxious, but Blake reminded me that confidentiality rules existed to protect the kids, not to keep me in the dark maliciously. I had to trust the process and let the professional do her job without interference. Jake's first session was scheduled for Thursday, and Liliana called Blake afterward to discuss scheduling concerns. Jake had been more guarded and resistant during the appointment, which wasn't surprising given his age and awareness of the situation. He was old enough to understand that what he said might affect where he lived and how often he saw each parent. That created loyalty conflicts that made it harder for him to open up honestly. Liliana wanted to schedule 3 additional sessions with Jake before completing her assessment, giving him time to build trust and feel safe enough to talk freely. Blake approved the extended timeline and explained to me that this was normal for older kids in custody cases. Rushing Jake's evaluation would only produce incomplete or unreliable results. During the evaluation period, Melissa's behavior changed completely. She followed the custody schedule exactly, showing up on time for every exchange and never asking to switch days or adjust times. The financial demands stopped entirely. No texts asking for extra money, no videos, no threats about calling her lawyer. When I picked up the kids, she was polite and brief, handing over their backpacks without commentary or drama. Her lawyer was clearly coaching her to demonstrate cooperative parenting behavior before the final hearing. Everything she did now would be part of the record that Mariah and Liliana considered when making their recommendations. Blake had warned me this would happen, that parents often became model co-parents once court proceedings started, trying to erase months or years of problematic behavior with a few weeks of good conduct. I kept my own behavior steady and consistent throughout the evaluation period. The kids came to my apartment every Tuesday and Thursday for dinner, plus alternating weekends. We had the same routines every time: homework at the kitchen table, dinner together, then an hour of TV or games before I drove them back. I never asked them about their sessions with Liliana or what they told Mariah. I never said anything negative about their mother or tried to influence what they might report to the professionals evaluating our family. Blake had been clear that my behavior during this period mattered just as much as all the documentation from the past 6 months. The court would be watching how I handled the stress of litigation, whether I could prioritize the kids' emotional needs over my desire to win the case. Any sign that I was coaching them or bad-mouthing Melissa would damage my credibility and hurt my chances for custody modification. The call from Ruby's teacher came on a Wednesday morning while I was at work. She apologized for bothering me, but said something had happened at the school that she felt obligated to report. During recess, Ruby had been talking with another girl about a toy the other girl wanted. The girl had started crying because her parents said she couldn't have the toy until her birthday. Ruby told her that crying wouldn't work unless she did it right, that you had to look really sad and make your voice shake, and then sometimes you could get things sooner. The teacher had overheard the conversation and pulled Ruby aside to talk about it. Ruby explained matter-of-factly that her mommy had taught her how to cry the right way to get things from Daddy, but it didn't work anymore because Daddy figured out the game. The teacher documented the incident in writing and asked if she could share the report with Mariah, since she knew our family was involved in custody proceedings. I thanked her for calling and told her she absolutely should share everything with Mariah and anyone else involved in the case. Blake forwarded the teacher's report to Mariah that same afternoon. This outside observation from the school provided something the videos and my testimony couldn't: independent verification from a neutral third party that the coaching had affected Ruby's fundamental understanding of emotions and manipulation. Ruby didn't see anything wrong with teaching another child to fake crying for results. She thought it was normal, just a skill you learned like tying your shoes or reading. The fact that she'd internalized this lesson so completely that she was passing it along to classmates showed how deeply the coaching had impacted her development. Mariah sent Blake a brief acknowledgement that she'd received the report and would incorporate it into her final recommendations. The evidence kept building, piece by piece, creating a picture that even Melissa's suddenly perfect behavior couldn't erase. Liliana's final report arrived at Blake's office 6 weeks after her first session with the kids. The document ran 23 pages with detailed observations, test results, and professional opinions about what she'd seen during her evaluation period. Blake called me to his office to review it before filing with the court. I sat across from his desk while he flipped through the pages, pointing out key sections. The diagnosis section stated both children showed adjustment issues related to parental conflict and emotional manipulation. Ruby demonstrated confusion about genuine versus performed emotions, often mimicking distress behaviors she'd been taught rather than expressing authentic feelings. Jake showed anxiety about loyalty conflicts and fear of disappointing either parent through honest communication. Liliana recommended family therapy for all 4 of us, modified custody arrangements to reduce the children's exposure to coaching behaviors, and individual counseling for both kids to help them process what had happened. Her professional opinion section didn't pull punches. She stated clearly that Melissa had engaged in systematic coaching behaviors that confused the children's understanding of authentic emotion and appropriate parent-child boundaries. The videos represented a pattern of using the children as tools for financial gain rather than protecting their emotional well-being. Ruby's classroom incident about teaching another student to cry properly showed how deeply the manipulation had affected her development. Jake's anxiety about choosing between parents demonstrated the psychological burden placed on him by being caught in adult conflicts. Blake highlighted another section where Liliana noted my counter-strategy of performing poverty. While she acknowledged I'd been trying to expose the manipulation, she emphasized that using similar tactics had also confused the children about what was real versus performed. Both parents needed to commit to authentic communication and stop using the kids as pawns in their conflict. The recommendations included supervised visitation for Melissa until she completed parenting classes focused on appropriate boundaries. I would get primary physical custody with the understanding that both parents would participate in co-parenting counseling to establish healthier patterns. Blake explained this report gave us everything we needed for the custody modification hearing. Liliana's credentials were solid, her methodology was thorough, and her conclusions aligned with all the other evidence we'd gathered. He filed the report with the court that afternoon, along with updated documentation of Melissa's lifestyle. The new evidence included her Instagram posts from the past 2 months, showing spa days, shopping trips, and restaurant visits that didn't match her claims of desperate poverty. Her car payment records showed the Lexus cost more monthly than my rent. Credit card statements Blake had subpoenaed through discovery showed regular purchases at high-end stores during the same period she was demanding emergency money for the kids' basic needs. The court scheduled a mediation session before the formal hearing. Fletcher McIntyre, the mediator assigned to our case, Wanted to see if we could reach an agreement without going through a full trial. Both lawyers and both parents had to attend. The mediation happened in a conference room at the courthouse on a Tuesday morning. Fletcher sat at the head of a long table with Melissa and her lawyer on one side, Blake and me on the other. Mariah attended as the children's representative. Fletcher was in his 60s with gray hair and a calm voice that suggested he'd seen every family conflict possible. He started by explaining the mediation process and ground rules. Everything discussed here was confidential unless we reached an agreement. The goal was finding a solution that served the children's best interests without the time and expense of a trial. He'd reviewed all the evidence, including the videos, financial records, and Liliana's evaluation. Fletcher turned to Melissa first. He asked her directly about the videos and the pattern of demands. She looked at her hands and spoke quietly. She admitted making the videos and asking for money beyond the support order. She claimed she'd been financially stressed after the divorce and made poor choices trying to maintain the lifestyle the kids were used to. But she insisted she never meant to harm them. She thought she was fighting for what they deserved. Fletcher let her finish, then asked about the coaching. Melissa's voice got defensive. She said she sometimes suggested what the kids could say to me about their needs, but she called it helping them communicate, not coaching. Ruby and Jake didn't always know how to express what they wanted, so she gave them words. Fletcher pulled up one of the videos on his laptop and turned the screen toward her. It showed Ruby holding a sign that said, "Daddy won't help us," with tears running down her face. He asked if 5-year-old Ruby had written those words herself. Melissa went quiet. I stayed silent while Fletcher continued. He brought up her car purchase, the dates of her salon appointments, the designer bag purchases, all documented with receipts and social media posts. He laid them out on the table in chronological order, next to printouts of her text demands for emergency money. The timeline showed her buying a $300 purse the same week she texted that the kids didn't have winter coats. Fletcher asked her to explain the contradiction between claiming poverty for the children while maintaining an affluent lifestyle for herself. Melissa struggled to answer. She talked about needing to look professional for her job, about deserving nice things after years of sacrifice during the marriage, about the kids not understanding adult finances. Her lawyer tried to redirect, but Fletcher kept pushing on the specific examples. Why emergency money for Ruby's dance clothes when Melissa had just gotten highlights that cost more than the leotards? Why demands for Jake's school supplies when she'd posted photos from an expensive restaurant that same evening? Melissa finally admitted the money she got from me often went to things beyond the kids' immediate needs, but she maintained everything she bought ultimately benefited them by keeping their mother happy and stable. Fletcher took a break to let everyone settle. When we reconvened, he presented a settlement proposal. I would get primary physical custody with Melissa having supervised visitation every other weekend for 6 months, then reevaluation for possible unsupervised time. She would reimburse half the extortion payments, roughly $4,000, paid in monthly installments. Both parents would attend co-parenting counseling and commit to appropriate boundaries. The kids would continue individual therapy. Child support would be recalculated based on the new custody arrangement. Melissa's lawyer immediately requested a recess to discuss the proposal privately. They left the conference room and returned 30 minutes later. Her lawyer stated they rejected the settlement. Melissa wanted to maintain equal custody with no supervision, no reimbursement of any payments, and only voluntary counseling rather than court-mandated. She was willing to agree to stop making videos and demanding extra money, but nothing more. Fletcher asked Melissa directly if she understood that rejecting this settlement meant going to a formal hearing where a judge would review all the evidence, including Liliana's report. She nodded, but stayed firm. Her lawyer clearly believed they could argue their way through a trial better than accepting the mediation terms. Fletcher documented the failed mediation in his report to the court. He scheduled the formal custody hearing for 3 weeks later. Both sides would present their full evidence, and the judge would make final decisions about custody, visitation, support, and any other remedies. Blake and I left the courthouse and walked to his car. He wasn't surprised by the rejection. Melissa's lawyer probably thought they could minimize the coaching evidence and play up her role as primary caregiver during the marriage. They'd paint me as vindictive, and her as a struggling mother who made mistakes under pressure. Blake spent the next 3 weeks preparing me for testimony. We met 4 times to review every video, every payment, every interaction. He showed me how to stay factual and unemotional on the stand, how to answer only what was asked without volunteering extra information, how to let the evidence speak for itself rather than trying to explain or justify. He warned me that Melissa's lawyer would try to make me look like I'd manipulated the situation, that my poverty performance was just as bad as her coaching, that I was using the legal system for revenge rather than the kids' benefit. I needed to stay calm and stick to facts, no matter how aggressive the cross-examination got. I practiced my testimony with Blake 4 more times over the next 2 weeks, going through every possible question the judge might ask. He made me explain my counter-strategy over and over until I could describe it without sounding defensive or proud of myself. The goal was to show regret for involving the kids while still demonstrating why I had to document what Melissa was doing. 5 days before the hearing, my phone lit up with an email notification at 11 at night. Melissa had sent a message directly to me instead of through the lawyers, breaking the communication rules Blake had established. The subject line read, "Please read this before court." I opened it and found 3 pages of apologies and explanations about how sorry she was for everything, how she never meant to hurt the kids, how she was just scared about money after the divorce. She begged me not to take Jake and Ruby away from her, promising she would never make another video or ask for extra money again if I would just drop the custody modification. She wrote that the kids needed their mother and she couldn't survive losing them over mistakes she deeply regretted. I forwarded the email to Blake without responding to her. He called me 10 minutes later and told me this was actually helpful evidence because it showed she was still trying to contact me inappropriately and manipulate the situation right before the hearing. He forwarded it to the judge with a note about the continued boundary violations. The weekend before the hearing, I had the kids at my apartment for our regular time. Jake sat on the couch Saturday morning looking nervous and picking at a loose thread on the cushion. He finally asked if he had to talk to the judge on Monday and tell the judge which parent he wanted to live with. I sat down next to him and explained that Mariah was his voice in court, that she had already talked to him and Ruby about everything, and neither of them would have to testify or choose between their parents. The judge would make the decision based on what the adults said and what was best for both kids. Ruby came over and climbed into my lap, asking if she did something wrong by telling me about the crying game. I hugged her and said she did exactly the right thing by being honest, that telling the truth is never wrong even when it makes things complicated. Monday morning arrived and I met Blake at the courthouse at 8:30. The hearing was scheduled for 9 and would take most of the day according to Blake's estimate. Melissa arrived with her lawyer at 8:45, wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup, clearly trying to look like a responsible parent rather than someone who spent money on designer items. We all went through security and waited in the hallway until the bailiff called us into the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Judge Christine Hernandez, known for being thorough and no-nonsense in family law cases. Blake presented our evidence first, showing the videos chronologically from the first one 6 months ago through the final demands before the crying stopped. Each video played on a screen in the courtroom while the judge watched without any expression on her face. The progression was clear, from simple requests that seemed almost reasonable at first to increasingly aggressive demands paired with more dramatic crying performances. Blake highlighted the contrast between the poverty narrative in the videos and the photos from Melissa's social media showing expensive purchases during the same time periods. He showed text messages where she demanded specific amounts by specific deadlines with threats about calling her lawyer. The documentation took 2 hours to present completely. Melissa's lawyer stood up for their turn and argued that his client had been under enormous financial stress after the divorce, that she had made poor choices in how she communicated her needs, but that none of this changed the fact that she loved her children deeply and had been their primary caregiver throughout their lives. They presented no evidence that contradicted the coaching or the financial inconsistencies, instead focusing entirely on her history as a good mother before the divorce and her genuine emotional connection to Jake and Ruby. The lawyer emphasized that mistakes in judgment should not result in children losing their mother. After lunch, I took the witness stand, and Blake walked me through discovering Ruby's conversation with her stuffed animal, my decision to document everything and use my own counter-strategy, and my regret about potentially confusing the kids with my poverty performance. Judge Hernandez asked me directly why I had paid the extortion demands for 6 months before taking any legal action, why I hadn't immediately contacted my lawyer or refused the first inappropriate request. I explained that I panicked every time I saw my kids crying, that I couldn't tell if they were really suffering or just performing, and that the fear of them actually needing something while I refused to help paralyzed my judgment. She asked if I understood that my counter-manipulation had also used the children as tools in an adult conflict. I said yes, that I regretted that part deeply, but that I needed them to see the contradictions themselves because no one would believe me without evidence. Mariah testified next about her observations during custody exchanges, her interviews with both children, and her review of all the documentation. She stated clearly that Melissa had engaged in coaching behaviors that confused Jake and Ruby's understanding of genuine emotion versus performance, that this had caused measurable anxiety in both children about their role in parental conflict. She recommended primary physical custody with me, therapeutic visitation for Melissa under supervision until she completed parenting education, and mandatory co-parenting counseling for both parents to establish healthier communication patterns. Liliana took the stand after Mariah and discussed her psychological evaluation of the children. She testified that both kids showed signs of stress related to being used as pawns in adult financial disputes, that Ruby in particular had internalized unhealthy lessons about manipulating emotions to get rewards. She stated both children needed stability and freedom from any further involvement in parental conflicts, that their emotional development depended on clear boundaries between adult issues and child experiences. Judge Hernandez asked Liliana if she believed Melissa's behavior rose to the level of emotional abuse. Liliana carefully explained that while the coaching was harmful and inappropriate, she saw it more as extremely poor judgment during a stressful period rather than intentional cruelty, but that the impact on the children were serious, regardless of intent. The hearing ended at 4:30 in the afternoon. Judge Hernandez stated she would take the case under advisement and issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Both sides left the courtroom, and I felt exhausted from the tension of waiting to hear each testimony and answer difficult questions. Blake told me the judge's questions had been fair and thorough, that we had presented strong evidence, but that family court decisions were never completely predictable. The next 2 weeks felt longer than the entire 6 months of dealing with Melissa's videos. I went through my regular routine with the kids, maintained normal custody exchanges, and tried not to think constantly about what the judge might decide. 12 days after the hearing, Blake called me at work. The decision had arrived. I stepped outside to take the call, and he read me the key points. I was awarded primary physical custody of Jake and Ruby, effective immediately. Melissa would have supervised visitation every other weekend for 6 months at a family visitation center. Then the arrangement would be reevaluated based on her progress in counseling and parenting classes. The judge had ordered Melissa to reimburse $4,000 of the extortion payments in monthly installments of $200, to attend court-mandated parenting classes, focused on appropriate boundaries, and to participate in family counseling with both children and me. The judge also modified child support. Melissa would pay me $300 every month, which was a complete flip from how things had been. The judge made it clear this wasn't about punishing Melissa, but about calculating what made sense with the new custody setup. The kids lived with me most of the time now, so the money needed to go where they were. Blake handed me the paperwork outside the courtroom, and I stared at the numbers, feeling weird about the whole thing. Relief washed over me, knowing the extortion was officially done, but sadness hit me too, because this meant the kids wouldn't see their mom as much. I never wanted to limit their time with Melissa. I just wanted the manipulation to stop. The first supervised visit happened at a family center 2 weeks after the hearing. The place had colorful walls and toys everywhere, designed to feel welcoming for kids going through tough family situations. I brought Jake and Ruby to the front desk, and a woman with a clipboard checked us in. The kids held my hands tighter than usual. Melissa sat in a small room visible through a window, and the supervisor sat in the corner with a notepad. Jake looked at me nervously, and Ruby pressed against my leg. I knelt down and told them to go have fun with their mom, that everything would be okay. They walked in slowly, and Melissa's face lit up when she saw them. She didn't mention anything about court or money or any of the adult stuff. She just pulled out a board game and asked if they wanted to play. Ruby hesitated at first, but sat down when Melissa started setting up the pieces. Jake joined after a minute, and soon they were laughing at something silly that happened in the game. I watched through the window for a few minutes before heading to the waiting area. The hour felt long, but when the supervisor came out with the kids, they seemed okay. The supervisor pulled me aside briefly and said the visit went well. Melissa stayed focused on the kids, asked them about school and friends, played games with them, and didn't bring up anything inappropriate. No coaching, no weird questions, just a mom spending time with her children. The supervisor would send a full report to the court, but the initial impression was positive. Over the next month, the pattern continued. Every other weekend, I'd drop Jake and Ruby at the family center, and they'd spend 2 hours with Melissa under supervision. The visits got easier each time. Ruby stopped asking me nervous questions beforehand, and Jake didn't grip my hand so tight when we walked in. The third visit, Ruby ran straight to Melissa when she saw her, excited to show her a drawing from the school. Jake started bringing his favorite book to read with his mom. Ruby stopped mentioning the crying game completely, like it had faded from her memory as just a confusing thing that used to happen. Jake seemed less worried about exchanges, not looking over his shoulder anymore or asking if everything was okay. The supervisor's report stayed positive. Melissa was doing what she needed to do, keeping visits appropriate and child-focused. 6 weeks after the custody change, family counseling started. The therapist's office had comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, with a small table in the middle holding a box of tissues and some fidget toys. Melissa and I sat across from each other with Jake and Ruby between us. The therapist, a calm woman in her 40s, introduced herself and explained that these sessions were about helping everyone communicate better and making sure the kids felt safe and heard. She established ground rules right away. No talking about adult conflicts in front of the children. No using the kids as messengers between parents. All communication about schedules, money, or disagreements needed to happen directly between Melissa and me, preferably through text or email so there was a record. The kids were not responsible for adult problems, and they needed to know both parents loved them no matter what. The first session focused on letting Jake and Ruby express how they felt about everything that had happened. Ruby drew pictures while talking, and Jake mostly looked at his shoes. The therapist asked gentle questions about what made them feel worried or confused, and both kids mentioned feeling caught in the middle sometimes. The therapist validated their feelings and reminded them that none of this was their fault. 3 months into the new arrangement, Blake called me with an update. Melissa had completed all her required parenting classes and was requesting the court move up the 6-month evaluation. She wanted to start unsupervised visits sooner. Blake's advice was clear. Wait for the full 6 months like the judge ordered. Melissa was doing well, but consistency mattered, and the court had set that timeline for a reason. Rushing it could backfire if something went wrong. I agreed to stick with the original plan. The kids were adjusting well, and I didn't want to mess with their stability by changing things too fast. Meanwhile, Jake's progress at the school became obvious. His teacher sent me an email saying his grades had improved in reading and math, and he seemed more focused during class. The school counselor called me separately to say Jake appeared happier and more settled during their weekly check-ins. He talked more about his hobbies and friends, instead of seeming distracted by home worries. Ruby's teacher reported similar improvements. Ruby was engaging with classmates more appropriately, especially when it came to emotions. Before, Ruby would sometimes try to manipulate situations by fake crying or exaggerating feelings to get what she wanted with other kids. Now she was expressing herself more genuinely, asking for things directly instead of performing for them. The teacher noticed Ruby understanding better when other kids were really upset versus when they were just being dramatic. At the 6-month mark, Liliana scheduled follow-up evaluations with both kids. She met with them individually at her office, using the same gentle approach as before. Jake opened up more this time, telling her about his favorite video game and how he liked having a regular routine at my place. Ruby showed Liliana her collection of stuffed animals and talked about her best friend at the school. Liliana's report arrived a week later. Both children showed significant improvement in their overall adjustment. Their anxiety about parental conflict had decreased noticeably. Jake no longer exhibited signs of feeling responsible for adult problems, and Ruby had stopped displaying manipulative emotional behaviors. The report recommended continuing family counseling, but stated both children would benefit from increased contact with their mother in an unsupervised setting as long as the positive patterns continued. The reevaluation hearing took less than 30 minutes. Blake and I sat at one table, Melissa and her lawyer at another. The judge reviewed Liliana's report, the supervisor's documentation from all the visits, and the family therapist's notes. The judge asked Melissa a few direct questions about what she'd learned from the parenting classes and how she planned to maintain appropriate boundaries going forward. Melissa answered carefully, acknowledging her mistakes and explaining the specific strategies she'd learned for handling stress without involving the kids. The judge nodded and modified the order. Melissa could have unsupervised visitation every other weekend starting immediately. Family counseling would continue for another 6 months. If everything remained stable, they'd revisit the arrangement again to potentially increase Melissa's time further. The judge emphasized that this was contingent on Melissa maintaining the progress she'd made and warned that any return to previous behaviors would result in immediate consequences. Outside the courtroom, Melissa stood near the water fountain, her purse strap twisted between her fingers. She waited until Blake walked away before approaching me. The kids were with my mom for the afternoon, so we didn't have to worry about them seeing us together like this. She looked at her shoes, then at the wall behind me, anywhere but directly at my face. "Thanks for not completely shutting me out," she said quietly. "I know you could have pushed for supervised visits forever." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I shifted my weight, uncomfortable with the gratitude when 6 months ago she'd been coaching our kids to cry on camera. They need their mom, I told her, just the healthy version. The one who actually cares about them instead of using them. She nodded and wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. I'm trying to be that person again. The parenting classes helped me see how messed up everything got. I didn't respond because words felt inadequate for the damage that had been done. She walked to her car without looking back, and I headed to mine in the opposite direction of the parking lot. The first unsupervised weekend arrived 2 weeks later. I dropped Jake and Ruby at Melissa's house Friday evening, watching them run up the walkway with their overnight bags. Ruby turned at the door to wave, and I waved back before driving away. My phone buzzed an hour later with a text from Melissa showing a photo of the kids eating pizza at her kitchen table, both smiling with cheese on their faces. Saturday afternoon, another text came through with Jake and Ruby at the park on the swings. Sunday morning, she sent a picture of them making pancakes, flour dusting Ruby's nose. At exactly 6 o'clock Sunday evening, her car pulled into my driveway. The kids bounded out with their bags, talking over each other about the weekend. Melissa stayed in the driver's seat, gave a small wave through the windshield, and backed out without asking to come inside or starting any conversation about money or problems. Jake told me about the movie they watched while Ruby showed me a drawing she'd made of their cat. No tears, no coached sadness, no manipulation, just a normal weekend with their mom. 4 months passed with the new arrangement settling into place. Melissa and I communicated through a co-parenting app the therapist recommended, keeping everything documented and focused on the kids' schedules and needs. We split the cost of Jake's summer camp without argument. When Ruby needed new shoes, Melissa bought them and sent me a photo of the receipt without demanding reimbursement beyond what the custody order specified. At the school events, we sat separately, but acknowledged each other with brief nods. The family counseling sessions continued every other week, with both of us participating and the therapist helping us navigate disagreements about bedtimes and screen time limits. It wasn't friendly, not even close. We didn't chat about our lives or share jokes or pretend the past 6 months of manipulation hadn't happened. But we showed up on time for exchanges, responded to messages about the kids within reasonable hours, and kept our personal feelings separate from parenting decisions. Jake's teacher sent home a progress report showing his reading level had jumped 2 grades. Ruby's dance instructor commented that she seemed more confident and less worried during classes. The kids stopped asking questions about money or trying to take care of me emotionally. They acted like kids again. Life found a rhythm that actually worked. Saturday mornings, I made pancakes with Jake and Ruby before taking them to the park. Wednesday evenings, they did homework at my kitchen table while I cooked dinner. Every other weekend, they went to Melissa's house and came back happy, talking about normal kid things like movies and games and what they ate. The monthly child support payment arrived in my account on schedule, a small amount that covered basics and felt fair given the time split. I stopped checking my phone nervously for videos or demands. Melissa stopped using the kids as weapons or props. The therapist noted in our last session that both children showed significant improvement in their sense of security and trust. Jake told me one night at bedtime that he liked not worrying about grown-up stuff anymore. Ruby asked if we could get ice cream the next day without offering to cry for it or perform sadness. We were all moving forward, slowly building something healthier from the wreckage of what Melissa had created. The kids felt safe, boundaries stayed respected, and I could parent without fear of manipulation or extortion. That's what mattered most in the end.